In the silent room, shadows stretched like living things as Daniel Carter knelt, whispering a broken prayer, his voice trembling with years of doubt and guilt. The candle flickered, its glow fragile yet stubborn. Daniel Carter said, "If there is meaning left for me, let me see it." The air thickened, metallic, pressing against his lungs like invisible hands. The flame twisted unnaturally, bending toward him as if listening. A vibration rolled across the floorboards, low and unearthly, shaking dust from the beams. His chest tightened, not in fear alone, but in a strange awe he could not name. The candle suddenly burst into cold white fire, brilliant and searing, casting every shadow into retreat. Daniel Carter shielded his eyes, yet the light penetrated through his palms, etching into his vision. On the wall, a silhouette grew taller, its edges glimmering like molten silver. No footsteps echoed. No wind stirred. The silence was crushing. Daniel Carter felt eyes upon him, though none were seen. Then came the voice, not through his ears but deep inside his chest, resonant and undeniable, each word leaving a scar of light within. The voice said, "You have been seen." Daniel Carter collapsed forward, every muscle trembling, as if the words carved through his soul. Tears fell freely, burning as they touched his skin. When the brilliance faded, Daniel Carter gasped, lungs aching as though he had been drowning. He blinked, but the white imprint remained in his sight, burning afterwards across his vision. The room lay silent, yet his soul rang with echoing weight. Daniel Carter said, "What have I seen? What do you want from me?" His words faltered, swallowed by heavy air. The candle now stood extinguished, its wax melted into strange patterns like veins of silver. His chest still vibrated, as if the voice lingered there. He trembled, unsure if it was mercy or curse. The floor creaked faintly, though no step had been taken. A shiver ran through his spine. His thoughts clawed for answers, yet only questions grew, deeper and darker. In that silence, Daniel Carter felt as though he had been marked, chosen, yet for what he could not tell. Outside the cabin, night pressed against the windows, but a knock at the door broke the stillness. Daniel Carter flinched, heart pounding, as the door creaked open. Standing there was Father Samuel Hayes, his lined face marked with quiet wisdom. The old priest stepped in slowly, holding a lantern, its glow soft against the dark. Father Samuel Hayes said, "You look like a man who has seen the fire of heaven." Daniel Carter swallowed hard, voice shaking. "Something spoke to me." Father Samuel Hayes placed the lantern down and studied him with solemn eyes. His silence was heavier than words. The air between them held more than comfort. It held a reckoning. Daniel Carter lifted his gaze toward Father Samuel Hayes, searching desperately for explanation. Father Samuel Hayes said, "God does not whisper without reason." The words cut deep, both comfort and challenge. Daniel Carter felt his chest tighten, fearing the weight of what lay ahead. Father Samuel Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, the warmth steadying but not softening the truth. Shadows stretched as the lantern flame wavered. Daniel Carter whispered, "Why me?" The silence afterward felt eternal, a silence more powerful than any spoken answer. The night deepened outside, the cabin small against the vast silence of the world. Daniel Carter sat trembling, Father Samuel Hayes silent beside him. The weight of the voice lingered, echoing like thunder within hollow bones. Daniel Carter said, "It marked me." Father Samuel Hayes said, "Then you will be called to walk where others fear to tread." The words hung between them like prophecy. The faint wind outside pressed against the walls, as though creation itself leaned in to listen. Daniel Carter's heart beat with terror and awe, knowing his life had already shifted. Darkness wrapped tightly around the cabin, pressing against its frail walls as Daniel Carter sat rigid, heart pounding with echoes of the voice. The silence was no comfort, it was weight, heavy and suffocating. Daniel Carter whispered, "It still lingers inside me." Father Samuel Hayes watched him, the lantern's glow etching deep lines in his solemn face. Father Samuel Hayes said, "When heaven touches earth, no soul leaves untouched." A sudden gust rattled the wooden shutters, though the night outside had been still. The air carried a chill, a creeping shadow that seemed to coil around the room. Daniel Carter gripped the floorboards, trembling, his chest constricting as an unseen presence whispered doubt into his mind. He thought of every mistake, every failure, every shame he had buried. The silence twisted into accusation, sharp and cruel. Father Samuel Hayes raised his lantern higher, eyes narrowing at the corners of the room. Daniel Carter gasped, certain something moved in the shadows. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Why do the dark voices come stronger when the light fades?" Father Samuel Hayes moved closer, the lantern swaying softly, pushing back the darkness that writhed like smoke. He crouched beside Daniel Carter, his voice low and steady. Father Samuel Hayes said, "Doubt often comes to those chosen, for shadows strike hardest at the cold." Daniel Carter shook his head, his lips trembling. "I am no one worthy of being called." The words cracked like broken glass in his throat. Father Samuel Hayes sighed, lines of grief deepening across his aged face. His own faith was weathered, yet he bore it with weary strength. For a fleeting moment, Daniel Carter glimpsed uncertainty flickering in the priest's eyes, an echo of hidden doubts. The lantern light wavered, painting their faces in trembling gold and black. The air grew heavier, as though the silence demanded belief or surrender. Father Samuel Hayes placed a firm hand on Daniel Carter's shoulder, whispering, "Even faith can tremble, but trembling faith still stands." The door creaked open suddenly, and Thomas Reed stepped inside, his sharp eyes narrowing in suspicion. Thomas Reed said, "I saw the light from the fields. What trick are you playing here?" His tone cut like steel, every word dripping with disbelief. Daniel Carter recoiled, his body tightening under the weight of accusation. Father Samuel Hayes raised his hand in calm, but said nothing, waiting for truth to reveal itself. Thomas Reed scoffed, pacing into the cabin, his boots heavy against the boards. He said, "You speak of visions, of whispers, madness, or worse, manipulation." His rational mind clung to reason, unwilling to bow to mystery. Daniel Carter's breath trembled as he answered, "It was real. It spoke to me." Thomas Reed's eyes flickered with unease, though his jaw remained tight. The tension in the room thickened, faith and doubt colliding like storm winds trapped within fragile walls. As silence stretched, a soft shuffle at the doorway revealed Margaret Lewis, her weary face carrying years of regret. Margaret Lewis stepped inside, her hands trembling as she clutched a small wooden cross. Margaret Lewis said, "I know what he speaks of, for I too have been haunted." Her voice cracked with shame, her eyes downcast. Daniel Carter looked at her with startled recognition, sensing a burden carved deep into her soul. Thomas Reed crossed his arms, his brow furrowed in disdain. Father Samuel Hayes regarded her with quiet compassion, as though he had long awaited her return. Margaret Lewis lifted her gaze, tears brimming, and said, "I have walked the road of guilt, begging forgiveness that seemed forever out of reach." Her presence filled the cabin with a different kind of weight, a sorrow that cut as deep as doubt itself. The room now held 4 souls bound by shadows and light. Daniel Carter felt torn between voices, Thomas Reed's sharp disbelief, Father Samuel Hayes' tempered guidance, and Margaret Lewis' sorrowful confession. Each word pressed against his heart, shaping doubt and hope together. Daniel Carter said, "Which of you speaks the truth, or do all your voices mean nothing without the whisper I heard?" Silence answered louder than words. Thomas Reed muttered, "Truth does not burn candles into silver fire." Father Samuel Hayes replied softly, "Truth burns in the soul, not the wax." Margaret Lewis clutched her cross, whispering through tears, "Truth can heal even the shattered." Daniel Carter buried his face in his hands, the weight of their words crashing against the echo of the whisper, still carved inside him. He trembled, sensing the battle within was only beginning. The night deepened, And Daniel Carter walked alone through the forest, his thoughts clawing at him with unrelenting whispers. The trees seemed to bend inward, closing him in, their branches like claws. The air pressed against his chest with every step. He heard a voice not his own, sharp and tempting, hissing promises of power. The shadow of temptation coiled around his mind, whispering, "Freedom lies in surrender, not in chains of faith." Daniel Carter shook his head, his voice trembling as he said, "You are not the voice I heard." The forest pulsed with unnatural silence, as though the world itself waited for his choice. Each step grew heavier, his knees buckling beneath unseen weight. He felt the presence of darkness taunting him with illusions of strength, dangling false freedom before his eyes. His heart cried for escape, yet he could not run. Through the thick fog stepped Margaret Lewis, clutching her wooden cross as though it were life itself. Her voice broke the silence, carrying sorrow heavy as chains. Margaret Lewis said, "Do not believe the lies, for I once listened, and it nearly destroyed me." Daniel Carter turned to her, his face pale, his breath quick. She moved closer, her steps slow but determined, her eyes wet with memory. Margaret Lewis said, "Darkness will always dress as freedom, but its price is your soul." Daniel Carter stared at her, the weight of her confession trembling in the night air. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You endured this too?" Margaret Lewis nodded, her lips trembling. "I was nearly lost, but grace found me broken." Her words carried the strength of scars, a truth carved into her very being. From the shadows emerged Thomas Reed, his eyes sharp yet unsettled. He said, "I followed you to prove this was madness, but what I saw, I cannot explain." His breath was heavy, his tone uncertain, though his words tried to sound firm. Daniel Carter looked at him, eyes wide, desperate for belief. Thomas Reed's jaw clenched as he continued, "I do not trust in spirits, but I saw a light no science can name." His words hung in the cold air like fragile glass, threatening to shatter. Daniel Carter whispered, "Then you know I am not mad." Thomas Reed turned away, conflicted, his disbelief shaken but not destroyed. He muttered, "What you saw should not be possible." Yet doubt cracked in his eyes, a fracture where truth pressed through. Father Samuel Hayes appeared from the darkness, his lantern glowing faintly, his presence steady as stone. He raised the light, its golden glow cutting through the mist. Father Samuel Hayes said, "Do not yield, Daniel Carter. The shadow feeds on your despair." His voice carried both command and compassion. Daniel Carter trembled, clutching his chest as though holding the voice inside him. Father Samuel Hayes lifted his hand in prayer, his words calm and firm, weaving through the night like a shield. The air shifted, the oppressive silence breaking with his whispered invocation. Thomas Reed lowered his gaze, uneasy, while Margaret Lewis bowed her head, her cross pressed to her lips. Father Samuel Hayes finished his prayer, his voice steady, "Light still stands, even when darkness prowls." The forest seemed to breathe again. As Father Samuel Hayes lowered his hand, Daniel Carter staggered, falling to his knees. His eyes closed as visions poured into him, both radiant and terrifying. He saw endless light, vast and unyielding, yet also a chasm of darkness pulling him under. His breath came ragged, his lips moving without thought. He cried, "I see both salvation and ruin, and both call to me." Margaret Lewis knelt beside him, clutching his arm with trembling hands. She said, "Choose the voice that heals, not the one that devours." Thomas Reed stood frozen, his face pale, caught between denial and wonder. Father Samuel Hayes lowered his lantern, his gaze firm yet sorrowful. The vision tore through Daniel Carter like fire and ice, leaving him gasping on the forest floor, trembling with the weight of his soul's trial. The mist thickened until the forest seemed unreal, and then the air split with a radiance unlike the moon. A figure stepped forward, cloaked in light, its form shifting between shadow and flame. Daniel Carter gasped, falling back, his chest tight with awe. The others stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Father Samuel Hayes whispered, "A messenger walks among us." The light pulsed, and a voice spoke, neither male nor female, yet strong and endless. The voice said, "What is broken can be remade, but not without fire." Daniel Carter trembled, unable to lift his gaze, his heart trembling with both terror and hope. Margaret Lewis clutched her cross tighter, tears burning on her cheeks. Thomas Reed's lips parted, disbelief warring with awe. The figure stood still, radiant and unyielding, a revelation burning against the night. Daniel Carter struggled to his knees, his eyes locked on the glowing figure. His lips trembled as he whispered, "What do you mean, broken can be remade?" The figure's light flickered like living fire, its voice filling the air with weight. The voice said, "The vessel of your soul has cracked, yet it is not beyond the hand of mercy." Father Samuel Hayes lowered his head in reverence, his hand pressed over his chest. Margaret Lewis sobbed quietly, the words striking her own scars. Thomas Reed shook his head, muttering, "This cannot be real." Yet his eyes betrayed his fear. Daniel Carter pressed his palms against the ground, desperate for meaning, desperate for hope. The voice lingered in the air like thunder, more truth than sound. The forest hushed, but footsteps broke the silence. Thomas Reed had moved closer, his face twisted in need. He said, "If this thing is real, then prove it to me. Give me something my eyes cannot deny." His voice was sharp, yet desperation clung to it. The figure did not move, its light steady as breath. Daniel Carter turned, his voice soft, "You already saw the fire that no man can explain." Thomas Reed snarled, "I will not kneel for tricks of light." Father Samuel Hayes raised his lantern higher, the glow catching Thomas Reed's face, revealing doubt behind defiance. Margaret Lewis whispered, "Faith is not born from proof, Thomas Reed, but from surrender." The words cut through the night, lingering heavier than silence. As the others stood in silence, Father Samuel Hayes lowered his lantern, his eyes heavy with grief. He said, "I too once doubted. My faith cracked when loss stole the one I love." His voice trembled, the first time weakness had shown. Daniel Carter looked at him, startled by the confession. Margaret Lewis pressed her hand to her lips, sorrow filling her gaze. Thomas Reed froze, seeing vulnerability in the man he had thought unshakable. Father Samuel Hayes continued, "But still the whisper came, telling me even my broken faith was enough." His shoulders sank, yet peace flickered in his eyes. The forest seemed to lean in, as if listening to the burden lifted. The divine messenger's glow pulsed, its presence overwhelming as the mist swirled violently around them. The voice said, "Truth is a blade that cuts and doubt sharpens it. Only the one who chooses will stand." Daniel Carter clutched his chest, the words digging into his soul like fire. He cried, "How can I stand when I am already broken?" The figure's light blazed brighter, casting silver fire across the trees. Thomas Reed shielded his eyes, muttering curses under his breath. Margaret Lewis fell to her knees, sobbing, her cross clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. Father Samuel Hayes closed his eyes, whispering a prayer into the storm of light. The forest shook, every leaf trembling as though creation bore witness to the unveiling truth. Daniel Carter sank to his knees, his face pale and damp with sweat, his chest heaving as though each breath cost his strength. He whispered, "I am unworthy of any call. I am nothing but failure." His words echoed with shame, cutting through the silence. Father Samuel Hayes stepped forward, his expression torn between sorrow and resolve. Father Samuel Hayes said, "Even in brokenness you are not forgotten." But Daniel Carter pressed his fists against the earth, crying, "Every sin, every failure burns within me." His tears stained the dirt beneath him. Margaret Lewis knelt beside him, her trembling voice carrying sorrow. "I know this weight, for it once crushed me too." Thomas Reed turned away, muttering, "This is weakness, not calling." The forest pressed closer, its shadows heavy with despair. Daniel Carter shook violently, his body giving way beneath the burden of his soul. Margaret Lewis lifted her cross high, her hand trembling, her voice rising through sobs. Margaret Lewis said, "Daniel Carter, listen to me. I was stained with shame so deep I thought no light could reach me." Her tears shimmered in the lantern's glow. She clutched his shoulder, her voice desperate. Margaret Lewis said, "But mercy found me. Grace reached through the pit I had dug." Daniel Carter looked at her with broken eyes, whispering, "You were redeemed." Margaret Lewis nodded, her voice cracking. "Yes, though I thought redemption could never touch me." Father Samuel Hayes watched silently, his eyes softening as her words filled the clearing. Thomas Reed scowled, yet his hands clenched at his sides, betraying his unrest. The silence after her words felt holy, as though the night itself bowed to her testimony. Thomas Reed suddenly stepped forward, his voice shaking though he tried to mask it. Thomas Reed said, "I saw what I should not have seen. A flame that froze the air, a light that left no shadow." His words carried reluctant confession. Daniel Carter raised his head, hope flickering faintly in his gaze. Father Samuel Hayes said softly, "Then even your eyes begin to open." Thomas Reed clenched his jaw, muttering, "I do not want to believe, but doubt has already cracked me." His voice faltered, his body tense with inner battle. Margaret Lewis whispered, "The truth is chasing you." Daniel Carter cried, "Then stand with me, for I cannot bear this alone." Thomas Reed turned away, his silence heavier than words. Yet the tremor in his voice betrayed his breaking disbelief. Father Samuel Hayes raised his lantern higher, his voice low yet strong. Father Samuel Hayes said, "If you will not believe for miracles, then believe for mercy. It is enough to begin." Daniel Carter trembled, whispering, "But my soul is ash, nothing left to save." Father Samuel Hayes stepped closer, placing his hand gently on Daniel Carter's head. Father Samuel Hayes said, "Ash is where fire begins again." Margaret Lewis closed her eyes, whispering a prayer through her tears. Thomas Reed muttered, "Words do not rebuild a man." The night seemed to listen, the mist curling around them like a veil. Daniel Carter shuddered, his lips trembling as if struggling between surrender and despair. Father Samuel Hayes' face shone with both compassion and determination, a light against the pressing dark. The ground shook beneath them as shadows surged from the trees, twisting like serpents across the clearing. Daniel Carter cried out, his body convulsing under visions of despair, his voice breaking, "It is consuming me." Margaret Lewis grasped his arm, screaming through tears, "Hold to the light." Father Samuel Hayes lifted his lantern high, praying with fierce determination. Thomas Reed stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the darkness grew stronger. Daniel Carter saw flashes of his failures, every shame carved into his soul. The antagonist's voice thundered within him, "You are mine." Daniel Carter screamed, collapsing against the earth, his body writhing. The forest howled with unseen power. Every heart trembled as the battle of his spirit erupted into the night, despair threatening to claim him whole. The mist swirled violently, pressing the forest into a suffocating chamber of shadow and fire. Daniel Carter staggered to his feet, his body trembling as if torn between two worlds. He shouted, "I cannot bear this weight." His voice echoed through the trees, breaking against the night. Father Samuel Hayes lifted his lantern high, his prayer steady. "Stand, Daniel Carter. The darkness has no power except what you give it." Margaret Lewis fell beside him, her cross pressed hard against her chest, whispering broken pleas. Thomas Reed stepped forward, his fists clenched, his voice torn. "If this is real, then I will not watch him fall alone." Daniel Carter trembled, torn between despair and strength, the shadows clawing at his skin. A deep growl rolled across the clearing, as though the earth itself answered his cry. The light surged, and the divine messenger appeared again, its silver fire cutting through the storm. Its voice thundered, "The time has come for truth to be chosen." Daniel Carter staggered back, his chest rising and falling in violent rhythm. He gasped, "Who are you to command my soul?" The messenger's light flared, every tree bending in its glow. The divine messenger said, I am sent to guide, not to chain, but the choice is yours, Daniel Carter. Father Samuel Hayes lowered his head in reverence, whispering prayers. Margaret Lewis reached for Daniel Carter's arm, crying, "Listen to the light." Thomas Reed's face was pale, yet his eyes locked on the vision, unable to deny what he saw. The clearing pulsed like a living heartbeat. Thomas Reed clenched his fists, his voice breaking. "I cannot believe, yet I cannot deny." His words cut the silence, fragile and raw. Daniel Carter turned toward him, whispering, "Then stand with me, even if your faith trembles." Thomas Reed's jaw tightened, his eyes filling with fear and reluctant courage. Father Samuel Hayes lifted his lantern higher, saying, "A trembling step toward truth is still a step." Margaret Lewis cried softly, "Do not let him fall alone." Thomas Reed finally nodded, his voice shaking. "Then I stand with him." Daniel Carter's chest ached, but hope flickered through the torment. The storm above rumbled as though heaven itself bore witness to his words. Margaret Lewis placed both hands on Daniel Carter's shoulders, her tears falling freely. She cried, "You are not alone. I pray over you now for strength, for grace, for deliverance." Her voice rose like a song through the storm. Daniel Carter bowed his head, his body trembling under her touch. Father Samuel Hayes began to pray aloud, his words firm, his lantern blazing brighter. Thomas Reed lowered his head, his voice low but steady, joining them though his words stumbled. The night filled with prayer, voices rising against the oppressive dark. The shadows shrieked, recoiling from their unity. Daniel Carter gasped, feeling their strength surge through him like fire. His lips whispered, "I am not forsaken." The clearing erupted in chaos as the antagonist's voice thundered through the night. "You are mine!" it roared, shadows twisting into monstrous forms clawing at Daniel Carter. He screamed, his body convulsing, his voice breaking. "No, I will not yield." Father Samuel Hayes shouted prayers, his lantern blazing like fire. Margaret Lewis cried aloud, "Light, cover him!" Thomas Reed shouted, his voice raw, "Stand, Daniel Carter!" The divine messenger raised its hand, silver fire bursting outward, striking the shadows. Daniel Carter fell to the ground, his body writhing in agony, yet his eyes burned with defiance. He shouted through clenched teeth, "I choose the light!" The shadows shrieked and recoiled, the forest shaking under the clash. The climax of his soul's battle had arrived. The storm broke suddenly, silence falling, as if the earth itself exhaled. Daniel Carter lay on the ground, his chest rising slowly, his eyes filled with both exhaustion and awe. He whispered, "Did I stand?" His voice trembled, fragile but alive. Father Samuel Hayes bent beside him, his hand firm on his shoulder, saying, "You did more than stand, you chose." Margaret Lewis knelt, her tears of sorrow turning into tears of relief, whispering, "The light held you." Thomas Reed exhaled heavily, his face pale, muttering, "I saw darkness flee." Above them the divine messenger glowed softly, no longer fierce but gentle, its presence like dawn. The figure's voice whispered, "Daniel Carter, you are seen." The words did not thunder. They caressed, filling every heart with reverence. The night was no longer cold, but holy. Daniel Carter slowly sat up, his trembling hands pressed against the earth, his voice breaking as he said, "Why me? Why would God whisper my name?" Father Samuel Hayes looked at him with steady eyes, saying, "Because even the lost are called." Margaret Lewis leaned closer, her voice soft but firm, "Because mercy reaches deeper than despair." Thomas Reed rubbed his face, muttering, "If even you are called, then maybe I'm not beyond it." Daniel Carter's eyes filled with tears again, though they were not of sorrow, but release. The divine messenger stood still, radiating quiet light, its voice softer than wind, because love sees what shame tries to hide. The words fell heavy, yet healing, like rain after fire. Father Samuel Hayes rose slowly, his lantern now dim as though no longer needed. He said, "This place will never be the same, for heaven has touched the earth here tonight." Margaret Lewis looked upward, her voice breaking with wonder. Then let us never forget what was given. Thomas Reed shook his head, half in disbelief, half in awakening, muttering, I came mocking, yet I leave undone. Daniel Carter lifted his hands, his voice shaking. I was broken, but now I am heard. The divine messenger raised its hand, its form beginning to fade into the mist, whispering, Remember the whisper, for it is eternal. The clearing filled with warmth, though the night air remained still. Their souls burned brighter than the lantern. The divine messenger dissolved fully into the mist, leaving behind silence heavy with holiness. Daniel Carter stood, weak yet steady, whispering, I am not forsaken. Father Samuel Hayes smiled gently. His lantern lowered, his voice steady. No, you are chosen. Margaret Lewis placed her hand on Daniel Carter's arm, her voice trembling, and your journey has just begun. Thomas Reed looked at them with new eyes, his voice low but resolute. Then perhaps mine begins here as well. The forest no longer felt hostile, but sacred, every leaf shimmering with silver dew. Daniel Carter inhaled deeply, the air no longer thick with despair, but alive with promise. The night carried a quiet peace that none had ever known before. The four stood together in the clearing, bound not by proof but by revelation. Daniel Carter whispered, The day God whispered my name, everything changed. His words trembled, yet rang with strength. Father Samuel Hayes placed his hand over his chest, whispering, And so the whisper continues in all who hear. Margaret Lewis smiled through her tears, her voice soft. Grace has written its mark upon us. Thomas Reed looked upward, his voice low. Perhaps faith begins with listening. The forest was quiet, yet alive, the mist lifting like a veil. The stars shone brighter than before, as though heaven bore witness. Together they left the clearing, their steps steady, their hearts forever altered by what they had heard.